It was a long interview. To be honest, I didn't watch the whole thing, but there were like 500 things covered in that interview: simulation, family, politics, immigration, all that stuff. Most of it is not in our wheelhouse. Like you and I, our backgrounds are economics. We work in finance. Monetary policy is something we're both interested in, since we both, used to work at the central bank. And that there were really three things in like a very small sliver of that entire interview that I kind of piqued my interest, that I wanted to dig into. The first thing was his prediction that in 3 years, there's going to be deflation because the money supply is not going to be able to keep up with the huge output in products that are going to be the result of AI. But what really bugged me is like, why is deflation a problem for a central bank that can print money? It's something that's kind of always bugged me. The next thing he said, now that was 3 years in the future. The next one was like 20 years in the future, when he said work would be optional. And he also said there's going to be a singularity sometime in the future. He said we're going to start to, quote unquote, decouple from the monetary system. And then the last thing he said, and this is the distant future, in which money as a concept might disappear because we just have so much stuff.
If you have AI and robotics and a dramatic increase in the output of goods and services, probably you will have deflation. That seems likely. Because you will simply won't be able to increase the money supply as fast as you can increase the output of goods and services. Supply is a real hazard here.
I really like Musk in general, but he's too much of a technologist, I think. And I think he takes his technology ideas and just takes a big leap through economics and politics. And his predictions of the future are less good than his ability to build companies, is my very pointed criticism, I would say. It seems like a very big leap to say we're going to have deflation in 3 years because of AI productivity growth.
At the broadest level, he says so much that, like, basically, on the goods to inflation thing, price is just the overall money in the system divided by how much stuff there is. And if you have like a big shock to the denominator on the stuff side, then you're going to get downward pressure on price, right? We've talked about that here. That's fine. Right. That's basic, like just ratio math. What bothered me sort of wasn't so much his point, so much as the prediction that we just simply cannot increase the money supply fast enough.
Because you will simply won't be able to increase the money supply as fast as you can increase the output of goods and services.
Which just sounds crazy to me, because the Fed can like, quote unquote, print money. So like, how is it possible that the Fed just like making just like digits in a computer somewhere can't be the same speed as him making cars, or like him making whatever? But the thing is, he's right. So like it's right. Like it is actually, when I thought about this a little more, it is kind of difficult for us to, quote unquote, print money. Everyone talks about the Fed printing money. The money printers are going burr. We have this other channel, that Clear Value Tax guy is constantly talking about, they're just printing more money. They can just print more money. So then if that's the case, why is deflation? Why did Musk say that? And like, why do I kind of generally agree that the money supply is not going to be able to keep up with inflation if we have a huge printer? So like, after thinking about it now, whenever I hear that phrase that like they're printing money, I sort of cringe a little bit, because I don't think that's really what's happening. It's a poor analogy. And because if you and I were to, quote unquote, print money, if we had a printer here that could literally have cash come out the side, from like an accounting perspective, your cash is going up, obviously. And then the other half to that, because double entry accounting, is your equity goes up, right? You agree with that? And like, that's just conceptually really easy to understand, but that's not what happens at the central bank. Like, when they print money, they're printing a liability in order to pay for an asset, right? So like, their concept of printing money is they need to buy something. There has to be something on the other side of the transaction. Whereas when you print money, like when you and I think about it, and when I guarantee you most of the viewers and people who write this and read this stuff, when they think about it, they think the Fed's printing an asset. They're not. They're printing a liability so that they could pay for an asset. They can't just go out there willy-nilly and start, quote unquote, printing. There needs to be a transaction to it. And when you think about that, then all of a sudden, like this concept of printing money has changed from that to really what they're doing is just monetizing debt, which is different. They got to like buy some claim on future assets and they turn that into cash. It's not just, quote unquote, out of nowhere. So like we've seen the best way to have inflation the best way to combat deflation is to just give people money. And I think we saw that in COVID. I think that was pretty, if that was a monetary experiment, just give people money and you will have inflation. Like nothing could be simpler.
Helicopter cash.
And helicopter cash. And so it's like, now look, if the Fed can just print money, why is this hard at all? And there are, a couple answers to that. I think, the Fed is really designed to deal at the financial economy. It only interacts with banks. It doesn't interact with individuals. That's one. There are quite several steps removed from you and me. It's got to go through a bank, and then it's got to go through, a company, and then the company eventually gets it to the individual. Whereas the government can just have a straight line. They could just mail you checks, right? They could just give you PPP loans and then forgive them, pretty much. The Federal Reserve cannot do that.
The stimulus checks is...
There are so many huge obstructions between kind of the Fed just printing money and giving it to people. One is obviously political. Like there's no way that Congress would ever give the power to the Fed to just like give people money. Like, you think?
Well, I think you just gave one example though, right? PPP loans. I agree with your statement. I find it hard to believe Congress would give the Fed the power to give people money. Absolutely agree with that. But the Fed has gotten pretty creative in the past.
I don't know. I would want to see the accounting for something like that. Certainly from sort of the Fed to the banks to the Small Business Association to individuals, and then where and how it gets quote unquote canceled. Like who takes the hit for that? Where does that show up? It doesn't show up at the Fed. I'm almost pretty certain about that. I imagine there's something in between, which is that the federal government, took out debt, and it used that to pay for it, not the Fed. So the Fed's still holding on to the Treasury bills.
I think what it would look like is, like you said, there has to be some asset they're monetizing. And so in 2008 and 2020, they did these lending facilities.
It's MBS.
So on the balance sheet, well, no, not even MBS. It's just a new item. It's just a new line item. It's the PPPLF lending facility. And that's its own line item on the Fed balance sheet under its assets. To your initial question, like how would it get canceled? Theoretically, then the Fed could just wipe that initial thing off of its balance sheet. But that's what, again, like I said earlier, Congress would not allow that to happen.
Okay,
or at least without a huge fight.
Let me get to the accounting. Sorry. Let me get to the accounting side of this. Let me walk through the practical challenges. Just like mailing people cash, maybe you could do that. You would have to worry about things like fraud and the fact that you and I don't have a bank account at the central bank and all that kind of stuff. But the challenging part, I think, is, and what we were touching upon, is the accounting, which is like if you wanted to just theoretically, as you said, mail people money or just print money and give it to them, on the Fed's balance sheet, we're talking about a liability is going up, and then there's an expense of whatever it is. So let's say if you gave 300 million Americans $5,000 in cash, so that would be like $1.5 trillion. So on the Fed's balance sheet, liabilities will go up. That's the cash that was printed, quote unquote, of $1.5 trillion. It would be an expense because it's just cash going out the door. An expense eventually rolls through, the income statement and then into equity. So to offset it, it would just be down equity like 1.5 trillion. In your example of the PPP loans being canceled, so sure, you have a new line item on the balance sheet for a PPP loan, but we don't want to actually give them a loan. We just want to give them money. So you cancel it out, but you can't cancel out that liability. That liability is still out there. It's the cash is still in their hands. So it has to go through equity. So it's kind of the same thing, just with one more step. So that kind of got you thinking, is like, if you really wanted to do this, you got to get a little bit creative with the accounting and just start, you would have to just make up some BS intangible asset, like perpetual 0% interest loan or like deferred inflation.
Oh yeah.
asset.
Do you remember the $2 trillion coin?
No.
I think this might have even been before. I forget if this was right before or right after COVID, but I think Liz Warren and AOC, they were pounding the table about this for a long time. They said Congress will issue a single coin that is worth $2 trillion that the Fed will pay Congress $2 trillion for, and that is the Fed's asset. This is a real proposal.
I've never heard about that. Yeah, something like that.
This is a real
Some
proposal.
BS.
I forget if it's 2 trillion coin or 1.5. Wait,
What?
let me look this up.
Oh, I'll look this up. Yeah, this is news to me. I don't remember this. But that's kind of like, do something like that.
Yeah, the $2 trillion coin refers to a proposal championed by Rashida Tlaib, AOC's ally, using a legal loophole for platinum coins to fund stimulus payments during COVID-19 pandemic. Similar idea for broader relief, creating two $1 trillion platinum coins, inject money into the economy outside of normal debt limits. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an accounting thing.
It's just a gimmick. Exactly. But like we're talking about here, that would be some interesting solution to just give people money.
That would be an interesting solution. I mean, it just seemed, going back to this, it just seems insane to me that if we have something that can really quote unquote print money, that deflation isn't a problem. And this whole point that Elon made, I think accurately, that we just can't add that much to the money supply that fast. I think it, at the high level, is valid. And it annoys me that it's valid. That's like my first footnote.
Deflation's a really tricky issue for like a lot of those different reasons. That's why I was like, my initial point is like, Elon, I don't think just because we get more goods, I don't even know if we'll be able to get all those goods, but I don't think that guarantees deflation in itself.
Okay, so that's a good transition to the next footnote. So now, like, fast forward from that 3 years deflationary pressure to more 20 years. And this is what he says.
In less than 20 years, that maybe even as little as, 10 or 15 years, the advancements in AI and robotics will bring us to the point where working is optional. AI and robots producing chips and solar panels, and mining resources in order to make chips and robots, in order to make, you sort of complete that cycle. Once that cycle is complete, I think that's the point at which you decouple from the monetary system.
He and Sam Altman and the AI tech guys, tech bros, if you want to be a little bit derogatory. I think that has a bit of a pejorative flavor to it, frankly. Tech bros, finance bros. Yeah. Okay. But they talk about this age of abundance. And, if you can dream it, you can have it. AI-powered robots that can produce anything that you want, and prices go to near zero and all that stuff, right? What he's describing is, in my past life, when I was writing these research reports in China, what he's talking about is commodification, where you would turn like a product into, like LEDs, for instance, into a commodity. There's just so much of it. You just flood the market with the stuff, and all of a sudden different products from different companies sort of blur together, and it's just kind of like one thing. It just becomes a commodity. I wrote about, I wrote a industry article for LED magazines way back when about this. And this is what I think you're talking about, in that you can't commoditize or commodify everything. So the biggest example there is housing. Tell me if you disagree with this or not, but housing really defies commoditization. And that's really having to do not so much the house itself, but its location. I mean, what do real estate agents say? Just location, 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 right? Proximity to other places. There are only so many spots you can get with an outlook on a lake or a river or like the mountains. A certain proximity to other people, right? Commute to work, the best schools. The other thing that really can't be commoditized is artwork or other things of like historical value or sentimental value, things like that. And so in that sense, because I do generally agree that the price is going to go down across like a lot of products. And we've seen that from like, televisions to computers, right? In that sense, what I think will happen is you'll start to squeeze down some expenses from like a total percentage perspective of your overall budget. But all that means is you'll have more room, quote unquote, to spend on stuff that cannot be commodified. So housing is the biggest one. And actually, I looked this up, and in 1985, 15% of your annual expense was on food. And today that number is 13%. So that's a good trend. The other ones that have gone down are apparel and services, transportation, reading, and tobacco. It's kind of interesting that, they still have tobacco sort of carved out as like a whole separate, it's like on the same level as housing.
But yeah, I mean, staple of American life still. Can't get away from it.
Yeah, right.
Right up there with housing.
Once upon a time, just want to be in that room when they put that list together. And they're like, oh, well, we got to have tobacco. I don't know why.
But I mean, like even today, it's, it's the same. It's just as important, I would say. It's just in different formats today. The vapes and, teenagers love vapes, just like they would be smoking cigarettes back in the 70s.
You think there's tobacco in there?
No, that's it. Yeah, you're right. There's no tobacco. I'm mixing up nicotine with that.
The other kind of problem with the tobacco thing, I think doesn't really fit into what I'm using as an example here, which is the reason why the total amount of expense on tobacco has gone down is because of commodification. Probably not the case. It's just people aren't smoking anymore. Same thing with reading, potentially. That's like its own separate thing. That's gone down. The things that have gone up, and this is the other half of this, right? Now, those things are housing, big surprise. Healthcare, I think that's another thing we're probably expecting. Education, and then personal insurance and pensions. If we just take a second to talk about like healthcare and education, I think those can be, and arguably education, if you just look at that word by itself, already is. I mean, all the information and education you ever want, so it's already online for free. Really, what education, why it's so expensive, is because you want the brand. That's what you're paying for. You're paying for like the Harvard, MIT, Columbia brand on.
And that's a good point.
I think that's the huge.
That's the piece you can't commodify.
Commoditized. Yeah. So something needs to be done about that. I think I acknowledge. The other argument for why education is so expensive is because the government got involved and all that kind of stuff, because they can charge that much. And one of the reasons they can charge that much is, like I said, this other expenses that you have been, commodified. We're not gonna dig into that. And same thing with healthcare. And we've talked about at length on this program the plan by which to fix the healthcare system using a company. But until that happens, hopefully you can get those two things commodified. There are other problems there. It's not just like economics. There are some like serious structural things going on there, which again, we talked about on that other episode. I could put a link below. It's one of the, disclaimer, it's one of the earlier ones. So I don't think it's, we
gotta pump up the views on those older ones.
Yeah, funnel them in there. Man, I rewatched it though. Man, it's slow. Low energy. It's like low energy and slow. That's like one of the ways I would define those. I think, the information I think is pretty good, but whew.
I'm still personally just too afraid to go back and watch anything that far back.
Yeah. It's
one of these days.
There's some cringe. There's some embarrassment you feel for your past self. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But housing. So I think, again, so healthcare, education, I think there's a path to commodify those. Housing, I don't really have an answer for because of that location problem. As prices for these other tangible goods go down, I think housing prices, I think, would still go up. And so this is one of the questions I wanted to ask you. That inflation number, you've made the point before, is kind of silly in the sense that you're trying to reduce all the gazillion types of goods in the economy into one number. And naturally, there's going to be some things lost in there. My question is, how does that CPI number or whatever it is, PCE that they use, how does it capture housing?
Great question. I mean, the answer to how do they do it, I know for CPI, I think for PCE, it's the same general idea. They just have this number of weightings, all these different entry points, and they weight them all differently. And PCE weights housing differently. That's why most recently PCEs typically have been below CPI for years. It's some of the things people are talking about so much. But this is, this is actually something good to look at maybe in a future episode. But back to your initial point, they just weight these things and then they try to sum it all up into one number. And yeah, that's why I said it's silly. It's if you've got housing inflation through the roof, but everything else deflationary. what does that even mean, really?
You're missing something. So like, so that then you start getting into the area of, maybe 3 years from now, per Musk, he's right in the sense that all these other goods are going down, but the inflation numbers are still like 2%, but it's all driven by housing or something like that. So then that's when, the kind of bureaucrats or anyone who actually comes up with these, the processes, right? The methods by which these numbers are calculated, can start tweaking things under the hood, and you kind of start getting to whatever number you really want. And that's something that, you and I, anyone who's got their fingers really in like the formulas and the models and stuff like that, are like aware that these things like this can happen. So I would be on the lookout for that in the future, to like show politicians, whatever wants to drive it, say like, look, inflation's fine. It's 2%, 3%, 1%. Exactly. Don't worry about it. But then, the price of everything's going down. Now let's get on to the third clip, the third point he was talking about.
Long term, I think money disappears as a concept. Honestly, it's kind of strange, but if AI and robotics are big enough to satisfy all human needs, then money is no longer, its relevance declines dramatically. I'm not sure we will have it. So energy is the true currency. This is why I said Bitcoin is based on energy. You can't legislate energy. You can't just pass a law and suddenly have a lot of energy. We won't have money, and probably we'll just have energy, power generation as the de facto currency.
He's kind of hopping from one association to another in these interviews. I think that's sort of my first takeaway. So the first one is like money. Oh, Bitcoin, energy. And then after this, you didn't see it on the clip, but he started talking about the Kardashev scales and like civilization and stuff. It sounds like he's just sort of talking.
Podcast.
But like a podcast. But he sort of brought up two things that I would want to point down to when he mentioned the Bitcoin and the energy. So first off, just real quick, back in the old days, the dollar used to be backed by an asset, backed by gold. You could go to the government or something, and you could have it exchange a dollar bill for a certain amount of gold. That was a asset-backed monetary system. And the thing about that is the money supply cannot expand in that sense faster than the underlying asset. So if you wanted to issue more currency, you had to get more gold first. So there was a natural like limiting factor to that. The gold supply could not be easily expanded. You can't just print money anymore without devaluing all the other dollars out there in existence. Musk's point with this energy thing in Bitcoin is kind of like that. I think that's the point he's trying to make, which is that you can't just legislate new Bitcoin. You actually have to spend energy to get it. So you can't just freely expand the money supply. And like in that sense, it's kind of like an asset-backed currency. But at the same time, you can't just take a Bitcoin, go and trade it for energy. That's not like it's not actually energy. It took energy to create it, and you can't, expand it without spending more energy. But it's not really like an asset-backed thing, right? That's an important difference. So in that sense, yes, it's like the gold standard in that you can't expand upon the supply quickly. Agree with that. But it's not the same because you can't just go and trade it. You can't just turn it back into energy. There are some advantages not being able to randomly expand the money supply, but there are serious disadvantages to this. And like a big reason why we moved away from that is so the Fed can provide liquidity during a banking panic. So like if people start freaking out, the Fed has literally like unlimited amount of, kind of this quote unquote, printing power to buy up other assets and exchange it for currency immediately. So it can provide liquidity immediately because it can print money, quote unquote.
I like the idea where he's saying that, energy is the kind of currency. Like fundamentally, I agree, right? But like you said, it's not a direct link to something like Bitcoin. It takes energy to, find a Bitcoin, like it takes energy to find some gold in the world, but they're not directly tradable. Now they're all these, kind of valued assets, but they all fluctuate in price wildly. And it's kind of like a strange way of going between energy creation and energy consumption, I think is kind of your point, which I would agree with. I just don't think practically we're going to see that kind of future, even in like 20 years. There's just going to be too many hiccups along the way that we've been pointing out systematically throughout this episode that is going to push that into, like a much longer term sci-fi dream, maybe in a couple hundred years or something. But I just think it's just not even that close on the horizon, really.
I guess I would say, he's sort of straddling two lines here. He's mentioning it first, describing a future in which he thinks there is no currency, or it's like different from how we currently see it. And then he talks about Bitcoin, which he describes as currency. So maybe he really means like, after maybe Bitcoin will take over for a little bit or something, but then eventually we'll go into this world where we don't need money at all. And if I were to guess, I think way far in the future, our currency is going to look a lot different, but I'm going to make sort of a philosophical point here. I'm going to say at that point, when people have met all of their just physical basic needs, I think at the end of the day, what people will value is status. I think that's really what people value today. And I think we're going to have some sort of currency that's going to be based on like favors or status, something that you owe other people. I don't know what it's going to look like, but if you want to gather a lot of wealth or achieve a lot of status in this new future, you don't do it with a bunch of goods like we do today. I'll leave you with like, this is kind of like one other thing I was thinking about, and that has to do with how cultures are defined. I think cultures are ultimately defined by the shape of their sort of status pyramid, like who gets to the top, who is the coolest people, quote unquote, in that society. That's how the culture is defined. So like, I can give you some examples, like high school culture, who's the coolest people? It's like the basketball in America. It's like the basketball and the football players and stuff, right? I mean, that's like a clearly defined sort of, hierarchy. In like a different culture,
there's
like
been movies
China,
made about
which
that.
I lived in for a while. Like what? What do you mean? Like this philosophical point? Or are you talking about just like high school
about
jocks and stuff?
High school jocks and movies.
Yeah, right, sure. And like we as social animals, we are extremely adept at figuring out what the shape of the hierarchy looks like. Like as soon as you land someplace new, that's sort of the first thing you're trying to figure out is like, who are the cool kids? Who's got all the status? Another culture could be like, the Chinese high school, as I was mentioning, it's sort of more, the cool kids are often also the smartest. Bam, that's a different look and culture. You could go to warrior cultures. The people at the top are the best fighters. Sparta versus Athens. All of it, like culture, I think comes down to what those status things look like. And so in the future, I think the culture is probably going to somehow reflect that same thing. And if today in America, if you want to get status, you got a lot of money in certain circles, you have a whole lot of wealth, but maybe in the future that's meaningless. So you accumulate something else, and that would be like favor or reputation. And then that would be the underlying currency. I'm reading right now The Count of Monte Cristo. Good book. A classic for a reason. But I'm sort of gathering The Count of Monte Cristo, I just got this impression that he's going around right now. I'm kind of still at the beginning. It's a super long book, so that means I'm like 10 and 15 hours in, and I'm still like at the beginning. But it feels like he's just gathering and accumulating a whole bunch of favors. Like his ledger is black, and he's just got a whole bunch of favors set up. That's what it feels like right now. And I feel like if you were to somehow put that into like a bill, that would be our currency.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great philosophical point. It's kind of like asking the question, without technology and without everything else, if everything else falls away, it's like what are we left with? Just other people, our social systems and structures. And then way back far enough, like before civilization itself, before any currency, I got to imagine that's how, groups of people got along, really. You get consensus, you get something done, you do that via social capital. There was no way of accounting for it. Just people just kind of knew, and it came out and people figured it out. So there's going to be something like fundamentally, I think what you're describing is like the exact same thing.
Yeah, right. But like in prehistory, you were constrained by the number of people that you knew. Something like these groups were like 100 tribes, were like 100 people, because that's how much like one person could keep track of. But in the future, maybe there's some other like mental ledger that you have. Anyway, because you got stuff in your brain anyway. Anyway, totally wild. But I wanted to mention that. I think like, you know, another little footnote to his comment. And that's all I had for you today, Joe. Hope that was
great.
interesting.
Yeah, no, this is
likewise, people at home.
Super interesting.
This has been another episode of the Root of All Evil podcast. I'm Luke.
I'm Joe.
All right, we'll see you next week. Take care.
See you then. Bye.